Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second brown bag lunch of 2020 fall. And we're diving into different topics this semester. We wanted to return to one that's really at the heart and soul of what we do here at the Bentley Research Office. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Erica Bentley today. Erica has been serving as the Director of Pre-Award Services since January of 2019. So she came into the office around the same time that I did. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Duncan Lorimer, serving as the Associate Dean for Research. Erica, as Director of Pre-Award Services, comes to us with great experience working in pre-award and post-award, all things related to grant preparation in different posts around the university over the last decade or so. And we're really fortunate to have her. She's given us one of these tutorials back in the spring, and we thought we'd take advantage of the format that we're in right now to record this one. And so we're glad you're here, and you'll be able to watch this at a later date as well. So welcome if you're joining us asynchronously. I'm going to turn it over to Erica in a moment, but I think the format is that she will talk, and you will feel free to interject via the chat window. Probably that's the best way, and we can interrupt as needed. But there'll be plenty of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation as well. So if you want to save your questions for them, that's absolutely fine. And then there will be a survey link distributed at the end as well. And we greatly appreciate that. So without further ado, let me turn over to Erica for the Budget Masterclass.
Great, thanks, Duncan. Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us on this very exciting topic of budgets. If you know me, you know I could talk about budgets all day and allowable costs and allocable costs and all that fun stuff. So thanks for being here, and let's just go ahead. I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as I can. But yeah, if you have questions, put them in the chat, and we'll stop halfway through just to make sure we're not missing any questions. And I also want to thank the team. So we've got Leah Heron, who is our grant administrator in the office, Story Clayton and Matt Doherty. They are our graduate assistants. They are so valuable to the office. And then we've got our post-award experts, Shelby McClure and Erica Longenecker, who are here to interject and share some of their thoughts on post-award if I say something that makes them want to speak. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and let's get started. All right, can everybody see our budget masterclass bright yellow slide? Fabulous. Okay, so as Duncan said, I'm the Director of Pre-Award Grant Services in the Eberly College. I realize some of you aren't in the Eberly College who may be listening to this presentation. So anytime that I say reach out to our office, you can still reach out to our office, even if you're not in the college. But I recommend that you also contact your research staff, your pre-award staff in whichever college that you may be in. So let's talk about grants. Here we go. We're going to talk about uniform guidance and the cost principles, an overview of those. We'll talk a little bit about indirect costs versus direct costs, which a lot of people have questions about. We'll go through some of the standard budget categories that we see on grant budgets from all kinds of different agencies. We'll talk about cost sharing. We'll discuss some common errors. And of course, we'll take questions and talk about anything you guys might have on your mind. So let's get started. But before I jump into all the nitty gritty, I want to think big picture. When I think of proposal writing, I think of storytelling. So of course, your narrative is going to tell the story about why it's important to fund the research that you're proposing or the service project that you're proposing. I think the budget also tells a story too. If you develop a strong budget, it's going to help you plan out your project. It's going to make sure that you have everything there that you need. It's going to help you determine if the funder that you're looking at is a good fit for the project that you want to propose. So if you start working through your budget and you see it's going to cost you $40,000, but then you go back and the agency is only going to fund $10,000, it's not a good fit. So I always think budgeting is a good process to go through, even if you don't end up submitting the proposal, because we all know we can't do what we do for free. And we certainly don't want to ask the university to pay for everything that we do. So I think a good, solid, realistic, precise budget is important. We also know that it is storytelling, especially right now with the pandemic. We don't know what it's going to cost to go to Thailand in 2 years, but we do the best we can to put together this story that we have used the best information available to develop the most precise budget possible. Okay. So our grant budgets are not guided by what we want to do and just how we wish things were. We have to follow uniform guidance. So we have this lovely, enjoyable bedtime story book that I keep near me all the time, our uniform guidance. So it's CFR 200. It explains what costs are allowable, allocable, reasonable, and consistent. So that's what we want to see whenever we develop a grant budget. So what does all this mean? Something is allowable. It has to be necessary and reasonable for the project, okay? Seems like a no-brainer, but not everybody looks at things that way. So it has to be directly related to the project. It has to be allowable according to uniform guidance, to your institutional policies and procedures, allowable to that specific solicitation. It has to be allowable per the rules of that particular grant opportunity that you're applying for. It also, their costs have to be determined in accordance with the general accepted accounting principles, right? So we've got to follow these rules when we're developing our budgets. And you have to be able to document your costs, okay? So a lot of times we see people who want to include some cost sharing of items they have in their labs or whatever, but it has to be able to be documented, whether it's a cost shared amount or a grant budget from the agency. It has to be able to be documented. So allocable is really important when we're talking about grants. Costs are allocable if they are specifically related to that project, okay? It has to be, again, necessary to the overall operation, and it has to be within the project period. So if you're proposing a project that starts from January 1st and it ends December 31st, but there's a conference you want to attend the following February, that's not going to be an allocable cost on your grant. Okay, so it's really important that you really think in terms of the project that you're proposing, and you're only including expenses directly related to that project within that time period. Then there's the reasonable person idea, that if someone FOIA'd the university and they released the expense report from your grant, would a reasonable person think that it's a reasonable expense? If my grumpy uncle, who thinks he pays way too much in taxes, finds out that you charged a trip somewhere overseas to present at a conference, is he going to think that's reasonable? So we'll talk about the types of expenses that are reasonable to put on a grant. But just remember that these are tax dollars and that it can be revealed what you're spending on. And your expenses may be rejected if you try to spend money on something and it comes across your post-award offices or your business office desk and it's not allowable, allocable, or reasonable. They can reject those costs and you're going to have to find another way to pay for it. So it's good to plan up front at the proposal stage to make sure that all of your costs are allowable, allocable, and reasonable. And then consistent. We want to treat costs consistently, regardless of the funding source. So we want to charge salaries consistently. We want to treat travel consistently. As an institution, we need to show that we're being consistent in the way that we're charging our costs. Same with indirect costs and direct costs. We don't want something to be a direct cost on one grant, and then the next person proposes that same cost. It's not included because it's an indirect cost. So we are here to help you with all of these things and to help you determine whether things are allowable, allocable, reasonable, and consistent. So don't feel like you're out there on your own. We see these things all the time and we're happy to help. So we talked a little bit about direct versus indirect costs. You're probably like, what the heck are direct costs? What are indirect costs? Can I just have my money and do my work? Well, you couldn't do your work if we didn't have indirect costs. Our direct costs are costs that are specifically and easily identified with your project. And they're allowable under the organization's rules and the guidelines. Indirect costs are all those other costs that are incurred for joint benefit. So that would include your utilities. That would include some administration costs. That could include depreciation of your building or equipment that you use, the accounting staff. All of these costs that the university pays for to help with the research infrastructure at the institution are indirect costs. And some people really balk at, well, I don't want to put indirect costs on my grant. Why should I do that? It's going to eat into the amount I have available to do your research. Well, you're not going to be competitive for your research, or you're going to be more competitive because you're at an R1 research institution. Part of that is because we have indirect costs that help support the research infrastructure. If you didn't have a building to do your research in, you couldn't do the research. And we certainly don't want to have to go through every single budget and allocate the cost of your building or your utilities on every single project. So we have a contract or a rate agreement with the Department of Health and Human Services. So we go through a negotiation with them about which costs should be included as indirect costs for the university. So there's a rate agreement set. It should be accepted by federal agencies. It should be accepted by any funding agency. If there's an agency who has a limitation on the amount of indirect costs that are allowed, we will accept that, but it has to be a policy, okay? So it's really important. And I know the university doesn't bring back as much in indirect costs on grants as they spend out. So we want to capture every single dollar of indirect costs that we can. So direct costs, these are the things you're thinking about what you need to make your project a reality. We'll go through all of these in more detail, but these are the general categories. They may be in a different order depending on the agency. The NIH may put materials and supplies as a separate line, while the NSF doesn't. I think it's actually the opposite. But your grants.gov form may list them in a different order. But these are the general categories that you're going to be seeing. Of course, there's always that other category for things that don't fall into these categories. So these are generally allowable costs, assuming they're applicable and allowable on the grant. But what kind of costs are unallowable? I think it's important to also have that conversation. General promotion materials for the university. So recruitment materials for general university enrollment, not allowed. Alcoholic beverages, not allowed. Charitable contributions, objects for your office, promotional materials, things like that that aren't directly associated with your project are not allowed. So if you're thinking you need money for those kinds of things, you need to look elsewhere. I wouldn't rely on grants, particularly federal grants, to help pay for those kinds of things. Of course, I shouldn't even have to say this, but any items for personal use are a big no-no on a federal grant or a state grant or any grant. You'd be surprised what people have tried to do in the past. So I only say that because it has happened. So remember, these are not your dollars. These are the institution's dollars, and you have to follow the rules. Personnel costs. This is probably going to be the largest portion of your budget. People who haven't developed a grant budget before, I think, are always kind of surprised at how much money it takes. But people are our greatest resource. So we really do see large institutional grant dollars going to personnel costs. If we're going to budget for personnel, it has to be based on your institutional base salary or the institutional base salary of whatever personnel you're including on the grant. So if you make $100,000 a year, you can't say your base salary is $120,000 a year because you think you need a raise, or your chair thinks you need a raise. It doesn't work that way. It has to be based on your current institutional base salary. We budget that based on a percentage of effort, because we all know everybody has multiple responsibilities. So we would not put 100% of a faculty member's time on a grant under very unusual circumstances. We charge based on a percentage of effort or months of effort. A lot of budget forms require that you include one or the other. We like to include both in the budget justification, so it's very clear how much time someone's going to be committing to the project. We also do include a 3% increase, generally, a cost of living increase in future years. So if you make $100,000 this year, next year we'll add 3% to that, and the following year we'll add 3% to that. If you are expecting a promotion which you're all going to get promotions eventually, we want to budget those in. So don't forget that whenever you're developing a budget. If you're going up for tenure, we'll put a 10% increase plus that 3% cost of living adjustment. If you're going up for super professor or that continued academic achievement adjustment, I like super professor better. We also want to include those increases in your budgets because we want you to have enough money to do the work you want to do. And if you get a raise and you haven't budgeted, you're going to have to cut those funds from another area. Okay, so keep that in mind. And remember that your institutional based salary in terms of grant budgeting also includes any supplements. So if you are the graduate director in your program and you get a $10,000 supplement, that should be included in your institutional based salary. If you teach a yoga class for the university and it has nothing to do with the work that you do on your regular appointment, you do not include those costs in your institutional based salary. If you get a one-time pay to teach a course for some other program at the university, that is not included. Okay, so your supplement and your base salary should be included. So here in the Eberly College, most of our faculty are on 9-month contracts. A lot of people, most people budget their summertime to do the work on their grants. So we include summer effort on grants. The official university rule is that you can get up to 2.5 months of salary support over the summer. The additional half a month officially has to be approved by the provost's office. But if you're in a position and you think you're going to need full 3 months summer salary, come talk to us. We can work with the dean's office and Tina Lavelle to find a way to fully fund you for the summer. But the principle behind this is that you're not going to work every single day of your summer on a grant project. You're going to take a vacation. You're going to take some time off. So that's why they generally don't like to give you a blanket 3 months. They want you to be thoughtful about this. So whenever we budget, there's a lot of confusion sometimes over a 12-month base salary versus a 9-month base salary. If you're on a 9-month contract, depending on the agency, they may want to see your base salary on a 12-month basis. So we take the amount you make in 9 months, divide it by 9, multiply it by 12 to get your 12-month base. The effort that we show would also depend on the agency and how we're reporting that. So a lot of times on the budget, you'll see calendar months, which include the full year, academic months, and summer months. So if you know when you're going to be working on the project, you'll want to include that information. We just talked about this. But there's also academic year effort if you're going to be working during the year on the project. And sometimes you need a course release. A lot of other departments have mostly 12-month faculty, or they have more time to do research during the academic year. But I know in the Eberly College, our faculty teach most of the courses for the university. So if you decide that you want to spend academic year time on your grant, talk to your department chair. I can't stress that enough. Talk to your department chair. Discuss it with them. If you want to do a course buyout, it's 12.5% of your 9-month effort. But talk to your chair. We won't approve a proposal that has academic year effort unless we see something in writing from your chair that it is acceptable. If you're not doing a course buyout, you can participate in the academic activity incentive program. But again, talk to your chair. They have the forms. You can have that discussion with them. If you have questions about that particular program, send me an email or put it in the chat and we can talk some more about it. But yeah, it's really important to make sure that your department knows that you're planning to spend your academic year time working on your grant project. I also want to mention that we shouldn't put this in a budget justification, right? If you're going to request a course buyout, that's an internal process. If you're going to request the course buyout in their budget, you just indicate how many months or what percentage of effort you're going to be committing. You don't have to say it's going to be a course buyout. So we see that a lot, and then we see OSP go, take that out. So we don't need to include that in our justifications. All right. There is a salary cap. So if you are fortunate enough to make more than $197,300 over a 12-month period, and you are applying for DHHS funding, NIH, CDC, HRSA, NIOSH, any of those agencies, the base salary limit is $197,300. So if you're making $200,000 a year, you can't include that as your base salary. So we would calculate your percentage of effort based on 197,300. Sometimes it goes down. I've only seen it go down maybe once, but it's possible. So that's the salary cap. We don't budget higher base salaries for those agencies. The additional amount can't be charged to other grants. So 20% of your time is 20% of your time, even if we're not using your actual base salary. So keep that in mind. Some other agencies have different salary caps. So it's going to be in your guidelines. And I haven't said this yet, but read your guidelines. Always read your guidelines. There's going to be specific rules on each agency and for each solicitation. So it will usually say if there's a salary cap in your guidelines. And of course, we can help you. We'll read the guidelines with you. We will help you determine what the maximum costs are. Again, if you're fortunate enough to be making over the salary cap. Other personnel, you can certainly include other personnel in your grants. Takes a lot of people to have a successful program. Postdocs, we have agreed to charge the NIH, NRSA stipend levels for our postdocs. So it's $52,704 for a postdoc with 0 years of experience. So right out of a PhD program, brand new postdoc, that's the base amount. We do not include a 3% increase for postdocs. We do have a budget template that includes the NRSA levels for each year. So those are the amounts that the college has agreed to pay. If you're in a different college, talk to your business office and find out what rates you guys are paying. But I think it's pretty standard for everyone to use the NIH stipend levels. Graduate assistant rates vary by department, by college, and sometimes even within a department, depending on the work that that student's doing and the type of responsibilities that are necessary. So again, talk to your colleagues, talk to your chair, find out what the going rate is. You don't want to put in a budget $20,000 for a graduate student for 12 months and then find out your colleague across the hall is offering $25,000. You're going to have a hard time recruiting, right? So we want a realistic salary for your graduate research assistants, graduate service assistants on grants. Hourly students, whether they're undergraduate students or graduate students, you can hire students hourly. Those students do not receive a tuition waiver and they do not receive health insurance. So the fringe benefits are going to be different. But you can include an hourly student worker. If it's not going to be, they're not going to be involved for the full project, you're just going to hire them over the summer. There are a lot of different reasons why you would hire a student hourly as opposed to hiring a graduate assistant. And again, the rates vary and we can help you, calculate those costs. Clerical support, I would only include those if it's allocable on the project. If you have an amazing office administrator who helps you process your paperwork and do your expenses, those costs are included in your indirect costs. Those are not going to be a direct cost allocable to the grant. If you have a program coordinator who half of their time is spent organizing meetings, taking minutes, sending emails, gathering data, analyzing data, doing work specific on the project, you could allocate a portion of that person's time to the grant. Again, it depends on the role, depends on the person, not the person, but the position and what they're doing. It could be allocable. And we often see research assistants, data analysts, program coordinators on grant budgets all the time. So an agency won't be surprised to see that, especially if it's a really large grant that's going to be very complicated. So keep that in mind. And also remember about effort. If you put that you're going to dedicate 20% of your time, you're going to have to certify that on your effort report. Any grant funded position has to certify effort on effort reports. And they need to be accurate and you need to be honest with how much time you're spending on these projects. So don't forget that you should be getting those twice a year. And it's then an average of 6 months of time that you're spending on a project is what you're certifying. So if one half of the year you're spending more time than the second half, it's a 6-month average. That's my understanding. And Shelby and Erica, chime in if I'm saying anything incorrect about effort reports. There may have been changes since the last time I worked with them. Fringe benefits, something sometimes people forget about on a grant and they don't remember that there's going to be that additional cost. So our fringe benefits include everything you see there on the left: Social Security, Medicare, unemployment, insurance, childcare, terminated annual leave payout. The rates are different depending on the type of position. Your full-time benefits eligible is 24%. Your non-benefits eligible part-time positions, so I believe that's anything under I don't think it's under 20 hours. I forget the percentage of effort. But part-time positions that do not get full benefits, 7.4%. There's that rate, the 1.9% for hourly students, regardless of their graduate or undergraduate. Hourly students get 1.9% because it does not include health insurance. Graduate assistants who get a stipend, who get a tuition waiver, their rate is 7% because it does include health insurance. So again, you send something to us, it has the rates incorrect, we'll help you. Or talk to us at the very beginning and we'll make sure that we get everything budgeted correctly. These rates generally change July 1st every year. So keep an eye on our newsletter, keep an eye out for information from OSP, and they will let you know if there have been any changes. So, all right. Any questions before we move on beyond personnel? Anything? I think my chat is
flashing. Hey, Erica, I was gonna just add one comment. When you were talking about personnel, some programs will require a program evaluator, and if that's not in there, then that can be a non-starter for the grant. So,
very good point. We do see that very often. Yeah, so don't forget about that. And Leah noted that it's 53 FTE of 0.53 is considered full-time benefits eligible. Anything below that is not. Thank you, Leah. I appreciate that. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. Again, people, very important. Don't be surprised if your budget is primarily people. Okay. All right, next, equipment. Equipment is an item that has a single price, including all of the accessories and pieces and attachments that it takes to make it work, of $5,000 or more, and it has a useful life of more than 1 year. We see people budget computers as equipment. Generally, computers are not considered equipment. If it's a specialized high-speed computing computer that you need to analyze a large data set and it has a single purchase price of $5,000 or more, it could be considered equipment, but generally computers are not equipment. They would be considered materials and supplies. Same thing with refrigerators or freezers for your lab. If it's less than $5,000, it's not considered equipment. It's important to budget equipment properly because we do not charge indirect costs on equipment. Okay, so we have to put the money in a different pot if it's a piece of equipment. And then the university tags it, they keep track of it, they do the depreciation on it each year. So it's important to make sure that we make that determination correctly at the proposal stage. And again, you get quotes, try to get the most accurate, realistic information you can at the proposal stage so you don't have any surprises come time for the post-award spending phase. Travel, there's a lot of money that goes into travel. It's important for people to get together. It's important for you to disseminate the information gained from your project. It's important for you to do field work. It's important for you to have site visits. Travel is important, but it must be allocable, reasonable, and allowable. It has to be related to your project. These are the standard travel costs that we see. I don't know how many times I've seen a $2,000 travel budget. Well, that doesn't look like you put any thought into it, right? It's never going to cost you exactly $2,000 to travel. If you know where you're going to go, you can figure out an estimate. Granted, right now, travel costs are difficult to estimate, but we want to do the best we can with the information we have available. So this is another thing. Again, our office can help with all of these pieces. If you let us know what conference you plan to go and present the results of the research at, we'll pull that, the registration fees and find out how much hotels are going to be based on GSA per diem rates or lodging rates. We'll pull the per diem rates. And remember, per diem, 75% of the GSA rate on travel days. So there's a lot that goes into a realistic travel budget, and we want it to be realistic. I've had multiple grants come back and the agency wants more details on how you came up with the travel budget. And then you're scrambling because you just threw $3,000 out on that piece of paper, and that's not realistic. We don't want you to under budget. If you say it's $2,000 and it costs you $2,700, you've got to find another source of money for the rest of that travel. So we want you to be realistic. You want to think through these details. There are guidelines out there. And again, it's not always going to be perfect. It's not going to be to the penny, but we want to do the best estimate we can based on the information that we have. A lot of rates change. The GSA rates change October 1st every year, and our mileage rates generally change January 1st. So again, keep an eye on the websites, keep an eye on our newsletter, and email us if you have questions about what the current rates are, and we will certainly help you find those. Okay. All right, there's a question. I'm going to go ahead and take that while we're talking about travel. Melissa has asked, how do you budget for travel if you don't know where you're going long-term, like a 5-year grant? We see that all the time. A conference has only put out their schedule for the next 2 years, but you know you want to go to this conference every year. We do the best estimate that we can based on previous locations. So that's what we'll say. Location is to be determined, but based on historical locations, we estimate costs to be whatever. A lot of times we'll choose an East Coast location 1 year and a West Coast location the next year to give you kind of that buffer depending on the conference. If the conference is in DC every year, then that's pretty easy. But if the conference is international every year and you don't know where it's going to be, we just try to find a common travel location, budget what we can, and explain that's how you came up with the costs. I think that's reasonable. They can't expect you to know information that you don't know, but you need to justify it and explain it in your budget justification, how you came up with those figures. I hope that helps. All right. Next, participant support costs. I see a lot more of these in the Eberly College than I saw in other parts of the university, but our focus is education, right? And we bring in students from high schools, we bring in teachers and train them. We bring in participants to come to this university for specific training, for workshops, conferences, symposia, other short-term instructional or information sharing activities. Those are participant support costs. Not to be confused with participant incentives if you're working with human subjects. That's different. So if you're giving participants gift cards to participate in a research study, that's not the same kind of participant support costs we're talking about here. And again, it's important that we put these dollars in the right pot because we do not charge indirect costs on participant support costs. And once you've budgeted participant support costs, it's really difficult to move those funds. So you want to make sure that these are budgeted correctly. They can include stipends, subsistence, travel, registration fees, other costs associated with getting the people here on campus to participate in your training activities. We often see this as part of the broader impacts on NSF grants. If you're going to bring people to campus and you're going to train them to use an instrument, then you can pay them to come. You can pay them to stay. You can pay for their meals. You can pay for the cost associated with that training. So participant support. And again, if you have a question and you're developing a budget and you wonder, is this a participant support cost? Ask us. We'll be happy to talk to you about it. Other direct costs that we generally see on projects. We have materials and supplies. Again, it's got to be allocable. It's got to be reasonable. I talk about printer cartridges more than I ever thought I would. If you're going to try to budget a printer cartridge on your budget, are you really only going to use the ink for that particular project? If not, it's not a direct cost. It's not allocable to your project. If you know you're going to need one printer cartridge to print a large number of handouts for a meeting that you've budgeted, that could be allocable. So as we often say, it depends, but be careful. Pens, pencils, paper, general office supplies generally are not a direct cost on your grant. Publication costs. When I first got into academia, it blew my mind that everybody has to pay for publication costs. It was surprising to me. So you can include those on your grant budget. Again, it's got to be related to the research on that project. You can pay consultants, people to advise you on the project. If you need to pay to store your data, don't forget to include data repository costs, data storage costs. If you need computer nodes, don't forget those costs. And also read your guidelines, because sometimes some agencies have really restrictive rules on how you must protect your data. So you don't want to get into a situation where you are applying for a $10,000 grant and then realize you have to jump through all these security hoops to protect your data, and the cost of protecting that data is going to be $25,000, right? This hasn't come up lately, but there are some regulations out there, like for DoD grants in particular, that you want to keep an eye out for those really high data protection costs. Of course, you can charge for your animal costs. If you're going to refurbish a lab in order to do some new kind of experiment, you can include those costs. Tuition, you can include. Participant incentives, like we talked about before, the gift cards or other payments for people to participate in research studies. And then subawards and contracts are definitely something that we often see in grant budgets. So let's talk a little bit about subs. There's always confusion surrounding subawards and subcontracts. And we get this question all the time. What's a subaward? When do I include somebody as a subaward? Have a colleague at another institution, should they be a subaward? Should they be a consultant? Should there be a contract? A subaward should be set up if there's a co-investigator at another institution that has responsibility for programmatic decision-making. If you're going to publish together, if they're contributing to the scholarly and scientific conduct of the project, if they have discretion to make decisions that are going to change the course of the project or impact the performance of the work. If it involves human subjects or animal studies, then there should be a subaward. So we set that up differently. It's a subaward. We only charge indirect costs on a portion of the project. It runs through the Office of Sponsored Programs. It's set up differently. So we want to make sure to budget that correctly. Subcontracts, on the other hand, are more routine services. So if there's somebody who does evaluation services, they do evaluation for WVU, they do evaluation for Pitt, they evaluate projects the same way, the same time, every single grant that is presented to them, they're not going to make a decision that's going to change the way your projects run. They're not going to be publishing with you. Same thing for somebody who may be doing analysis of a genome or something, I don't know. Some routine service that's part of their standard business operations, and they operate in a competitive environment. That's going to be a service contract. That's going to run through procurement. It's going to be handled differently. And again, so think about it. Would they do the same thing for you that they would do for Marshall, that they would do for Pitt? If it's a standard service that they provide, that would be a subcontract, not a subaward. So I know that can be confusing. Again, we can help you figure that out whenever you get to that point and you need to make that decision. Indirect costs. What are our indirect cost rates? These are our current rates effective January 1st, 2020. They should be in effect until 2022, but sometimes they change. So if you have a question, let us know. Again, we have that wonderful budget template that our students have worked so hard on that always includes the current rates. So don't use an old template, come to our website, get the newest one. It has the up-to-date rates. On-campus rates versus off-campus rates. There's a lot of discussion about that in the Eberly College lately. If most of the work is happening on campus and you're not charging rent for an off-site facility, you need to charge the on-campus rate. Off-campus rate would only be if more than half of the work is happening off-campus at a site where you're having to pay rent, and you're having to pay for the utilities. Then you would use the off-campus rate. So again, if you have questions, let us know. If we aren't able to make that determination, we'll work with the Office of Sponsored Programs to make sure that we are charging the correct rate. And again, that we're treating these costs consistently. Okay, we can't just pick and choose which type of project should be on campus and which should use the off-campus rate. All right. So our bases, when we charge indirect costs, we take 52% and multiply it by the total of salaries, materials and supplies, fringe benefits, don't want to forget that, contractual services, not subawards, contract service agreements, consulting costs, travel, publication, participant incentives, most direct costs we charge indirect costs on. We do charge indirect costs on the first 25,000 of all sub awards. If they hit $25,000 in the third year of the project, then we charge indirect costs up until they hit that $25,000 threshold. After that, we do not charge indirect costs on those sub-awards. We also don't charge indirects on equipment, capital expenditures, patient care. We don't see a lot of that in the Everly College, but if you're doing a clinical trial, it's possible that patient care costs are included. Tuition, we don't charge indirect costs on. Scholarships, fellowships, rental of off-site facilities, and the portion of each subaward over $25,000. All this is laid out in our rate agreement. So it's very, very clearly written. We have to be consistent in the charging of these costs. So I touched on this for a second, but what happens if you are applying for a grant and the agency says we'll only allow 10%? Well, then we'll accept that, as long as it's an official policy. An email from somebody saying, no, I only want to allow 10%, that doesn't work. It has to be an official policy from that institution. Otherwise, they need to accept our negotiated indirect cost rate. So sometimes we charge indirect costs if it's a limited rate on the total costs. So if you have a $100,000 grant, you're only charging 10%, we charge it as the 10% of the total project cost. So it would be $10,000. Again, we can help you with those calculations. It gets a little funky sometimes, and USDA grants have a limitation that are different. Again, it should be in your guidelines. We can help you sort all of that out. But indirect costs are really important, and we want to make sure to capture as many indirect dollars as we can. And again, budget justifications are really important. It's that storytelling piece of your project. Why do you need the costs? Why is it important? What are you going to do with the money? It's a good planning tool. Different agencies may require different levels of detail. I recommend you always provide a significant amount of detail, as much detail as you can. It's also going to help you at post-award. If you, I like to talk about the example at an audit presentation I went to, where somebody had a bunch of Ziploc bags on their grant. And the agency came back and said, why are you charging Ziploc bags? And they said, well, those are the body bags for the parakeets that we're using in our project. Oh, that's a justified cost, right? So if you can think through those kinds of costs and put them in your justification, when the time comes for your business office to approve those expenses, they can go back and look at your justification and see that those costs have been explained and justified. So it's really important. And we can help you with those as well. Take your time, think through it. It's not unusual for someone to send us a budget. We'll draft a budget justification, which a lot of yellow highlighted areas, and say, give us more information about why you need each of these costs and how they're going to be used. Very important. Supplemental Form A's. You may have heard about these, didn't know what they were. You may be very familiar with them. They're task budgets. We don't want people to forget. If you have more than one person on your project, everyone should have their own task, especially if they're faculty. Maybe a program coordinator doesn't need their own task, but if you have a co-investigator, they should have their own task. This is an internal budget. It doesn't go to the agency. It just goes through KC, but it is required if you have more than one faculty member. That way that person will be listed on the green sheet. They'll be listed on the blue sheet. They'll be able to see the budget, the proposal, everything in KC. And their department will get a portion of the F&A back, depending on where they sit at the university. But we want to make sure that the F&A is credited where the work is happening and the expenses related to each person's part of the work. So we don't use the Word document anymore. We have spreadsheets, nice and easy. We attach it to KC. And then when it's time for the award, then it's all set up, and post-award can set everything up in MAP and you can start your spending. So this should happen at the proposal stage. We will definitely help you with these. If you are working with colleagues from another department, please ask them to create a task budget for you. If I see a proposal come through that includes an Everly College faculty member and there's no task, I'm going to make a note of it in KC and say, please establish a task for our faculty before this award is set up. So not something that's on the top of your mind when you're working on these exciting grant ideas, but it is really important. So don't forget that piece. Cost sharing, also very, very important. You know, we're at a position in this university where there's not a lot of available cash. We don't want people promising cost sharing in grants unless it's necessary. Some people think that it's going to give them a leg up and they're going to be more competitive if they include matching funds. Not necessarily. I think the agencies have learned that it doesn't provide a level playing field whenever people are including cost sharing. So like the NSF doesn't even allow it except for in particular circumstances. If you're going to cost share something, it has to follow all the other rules. It has to be allowable, reasonable, treated consistently. So you can't cost share something that's not related to the project. If you cost share something, you can't cost share it on something else. It's going to be dedicated to that one project. Effort that's cost shared, you're going to have to certify it. So if you say, oh, I'm just going to provide in-kind support of my time at 5%, well, you're going to have to certify that you spent that 5% on the grant activities. So we do not want cost sharing unless it's necessary. Don't just go to the research office and ask for cost sharing. Don't just come to Duncan and ask for cost sharing. Talk to your department first, because that's the first question that he's going to ask if I send someone to him. He can say, have they talked to their department? So make sure that you're, again, talking to your department chairs about what you're proposing. And if you plan to include any cost sharing, I'm going to need to see it in writing before I approve for the college. Duncan, you have anything you want to add about cost sharing?
I think that covers everything, Erica. I mean, I think it's just really important that that it's needed for the grant and that you really have that discussion with your chair, because in order for us to support you, we're going to need to distribute the cost between the college, the department, and if you have any discretionary funds as well, that's all factored into the discussion.
Right.
It's also good to, before you go outside of the college, to let the dean's office know what your plans are. Sometimes we have people that go straight outside, and that causes misunderstandings later on. So
yeah, and remember that anything that you cost share has to be verified. So you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're going to cost share a whole bunch of beakers you have in your lab, and then you're going to have to justify how you came up with the estimated cost for each of those beakers, or whatever supplies you think it looks really good if I'm adding this on my grant. Well, not necessarily, and it may put you in a position where you're going to have to do a lot more work on post-award than it's even worth it. So again, we don't want cost sharing unless it's required. That's the official university policy. Except for unusual circumstances, the university won't cost share more than they're going to get back in indirect costs, or the F&A. And remember, if you cost share, it's contractually obligated. If you're cost sharing the effort of somebody and they have a really high salary and that person leaves and goes to another institution, and you have a junior faculty who comes in, you're going to have your department make up the difference in that cost. So the department needs to be sure that they understand what they're agreeing to whenever they include cost sharing. And again, as the KC approver, I won't approve anything unless I have it in writing from your department chair or the other source of the cost sharing that it is approved. Some quick common errors. We're running out of time. Not budgeting enough for travel. We've talked about that. Not using the correct base salary. Using old rates. That's usually because you're using an old template. Not starting your budget early enough, making your budget an afterthought, just throwing something together and $10,000 here, $5,000 here, and that's not a well thought out budget. Forgetting the data storage or data management costs. I think we're seeing this more and more and more. Don't forget that. Not having approval for cost sharing. Again, if it comes through KC and there's no approval included, or I haven't seen it, it's going to sit there and it might make your grant late. So you want to make sure to have all of that in writing. And of course, not following the agency guidelines. The agency says you're required to travel to Bethesda, Maryland once a year for a PI meeting, and you didn't put it in there. That's going to be a problem. So read your guidelines, work with our office. We're really happy to help you. And, obviously I can talk about grants for 52 minutes and budget. So come talk to me anytime. I'd be happy to. Budgeting during COVID. We know things are unusual. We want to do the best budgets that we can based on the best information that we can. We know it's not going to be easy to do, especially in the next 12 months. But the agencies are saying, move ahead as if things are normal. There's this website here, the coger.edu. That's updates from all the federal agencies on how they're handling costs related to COVID and changes related to COVID-19. And if you're doing research on COVID-19, don't forget we have a research site with all of these different funding opportunities that we update at least once a week. So don't forget to visit our site. All right, these are the resources, because of course I didn't make all of this up. These come from real federal agencies and OSP and all kinds of other places. I'm just the messenger. Any other questions? I see a couple in the chat. I'm sorry this went so long, but I think it's important information. So, questions? I see a question. What if a COI is part of your department? Do we still need a supplemental Form A? Yes, we do. If another faculty member is in your department, you both want to get credit for that. So we do want to set up a task for every faculty member, even if they're in the same department. Any other thoughts? Questions? Here's our contact information if you think of anything, and if you want to talk offline about any budget issues, of course, reach out to us.
Thank you very much, Erica. And
you're welcome.
As you mentioned, we're always available for further questions. I know that Story, you have a couple of announcements to make, but I wanted to thank everyone for coming and just hold on for a little bit longer.
Yeah, so I just put the survey in the chat. So please take the opportunity. It just takes a couple minutes to give us a little feedback on this session. And there's also an opportunity to let us know any other subjects that you would like to see offered in future brown bags.
Our next brown bag will be November 17th. We'll be talking about the NIH. We'll have some faculty members who have served on NIH panels. So they're going to be talking about their experiences. We'll talk about the different mechanisms at the NIH. So join us in November if you want to pursue NIH funding. All right. Well, I'll stop sharing. If that wasn't enough, we will have a link to this video if you want to watch this very exciting topic again. Thank you all for being here and for listening and for caring about developing realistic grant budgets, because it's really important.